The air in Ms. Evelyn Donahue's classroom was always thin, heavy with 40 years of iron discipline and the reverential fear of her students. Known as the Wall, her math class was a rite of passage. As the students filed out for recess, she walked over to the desk of a boy named Alex, whose silence and constant doodling in his notebook had labeled him inattentive. With a sigh of impatience, she picked up his notebook to confiscate the evidence of his distraction. Later at her desk, she opened it to write a disciplinary note to his parents. And then, the world stopped. What she saw was not a drawing, it was an equation. A specific, obscure equation that made her blood run cold. It was the central problem of her own master's thesis, a problem her advisor had labeled an elegant dead end, and that had caused her to abandon her research career 4 decades ago. And beneath the equation, in childish handwriting, was a solution she had never found. Her whole body shook. With a "R" gesture no one would ever expect from the Wall, she picked up the final exam ready to be printed and tore it in half. Which country are you from? Tell us. If you believe that genius has no age and that a single moment can redeem a lifetime, sign up. The story of how a teacher's forgotten past collided with a boy's future is about to begin. For Alex, the world was a cacophony of patterns. His outbursts were the frustration of trying to find order in the noise, and math was his only native language. As Ms. Donahue spoke, Alex's mind was not on her words but on the pattern of her pauses, the cadence of her speech. He saw geometry in the floor tiles, the Fibonacci sequence in the leaves of the trees outside the window, graph theory in the paths the ants made on the sidewalk. To him, everything was math. His scribbles weren't a distraction. They were his way of paying attention. They were translations. He transformed the chaotic buzz of the world into diagrams, shapes, equations that made sense to him. It was how he organized the overload of information that bombarded him every second. Ms. Donahue's class was particularly challenging. Her math was linear, rigid, a narrow path from A to B. Alex's math was a web, a 3-dimensional network where everything was connected. The notebook she confiscated was his refuge. The equation he was exploring that day didn't come from a book. He saw it. He saw it in the pattern of how sunlight broke through the window blinds. It was a complex, recurring pattern, and he was just trying to map it out. He didn't know it was a famous problem or someone's thesis. To him, it was just the window pattern, and he was trying to find its rule. Alex's outburst was the loneliness of being a translator with no one who understood his language. Every day he was instructed to stop doing the one thing that allowed him to understand the world. Alex, pay attention. Alex, put that notebook away. Alex, look at the board. Each sentence was a small death, a command for him to disconnect from himself and enter their noisy, illogical world. He wasn't defiant. He was desperately trying to connect. But the tools he was given were inadequate, like trying to describe a color to a blind person. The confiscation of his notebook was not just an act of discipline. It was as if they had taken his voice, his eyes, and his hands all at once. Evelyn Donahue wasn't born the Wall. She was built, brick by brick, on the foundation of a shattered dream. In the 1970s, she was one of the few women in her graduate math program, a sharp mind with a passion for topology, the area of math that studies the properties of space. Her false hope was the belief that her passion and undeniable talent would be enough to secure her place in the world of academic research. Her master's thesis was her big bet. She came across a knot classification problem, an issue that seemed unsolvable with the methods of the time. But Evelyn had an idea, a new and unorthodox approach that connected knot theory to a different branch of algebra. She spent 2 years immersed in this problem, working feverishly, convinced she was on the verge of something important. She saw the pattern, the solution, but she couldn't quite formalize it. One piece was missing. Full of hope, she presented her work to her advisor, a renowned and deeply traditional professor. He leafed through the pages, his expression a mixture of skepticism and disdain. His assessment was a crushing blow. "It's a curiosity, Evelyn. An elegant dead end. There's no way to prove it. I suggest you choose a more manageable topic if you want to finish this program." He didn't see what she saw. He didn't feel the beauty of her approach. He dismissed her. And in that male-dominated environment with no other mentors to support her, Evelyn's confidence was shattered. Believing him, she shelved her thesis, completed her master's degree with a safe and uninspiring topic, and abandoned her dream of research. A teaching career was her plan B. She entered the classroom with a broken heart, and that pain manifested itself as a suit of armor made of rigidity and discipline. If she could no longer explore the frontiers of mathematics, she would become the uncompromising guardian of its foundations. Her false hope was transformed. She believed that by being the toughest, most demanding teacher, she would be doing mathematics a service, forging students who would not make the same dreamy mistake she had made. She taught rules, not exploration, certainties, not questions. She became the embodiment of her former mentor, crushing creativity in the name of rigor. And she did this for 40 years, until the ghost of her own youth appeared, scribbled in a notebook by a quiet boy at the back of the classroom. The conflict that erupted inside Evelyn Donahue when she saw that equation wasn't about a student breaking the rules. It was a head-on collision between the person she was and the person she could have been. It was a reckoning that was 40 years overdue. On one side was Mrs. Donahue, the wall. This persona was carefully constructed to protect her. She was impenetrable, logical, fair in her severity. She firmly believed that discipline and structure were the only paths to learning. To that persona, Alex was a problem. He was the anomaly in her orderly system. His doodles were a sign of disrespect. His lack of verbal participation was a sign of disinterest. The wall wanted to give Alex a low grade, call his parents, recommend a tutor. She wanted to force him to conform, because conformity was the foundation of her controlled universe. On the other side was Evelyn, the brilliant young mathematician, the girl who saw a pattern in the knots that no one else saw. This Evelyn wasn't dead. She was buried alive under 4 decades of routine and disappointment. When she saw Alex's solution in his notebook, the buried Evelyn began to scream. She recognized not just the equation, but the form of the thinking. Alex's approach was playful, intuitive, visual, just like hers had been. He didn't solve the problem with brute force, but with a leap of imagination. He found the piece she had missed. The conflict was the agonizing battle between these two identities. Mrs. Donahue saw the childish handwriting and the classroom context, and it infuriated her. How dare this boy who can barely pass her tests stumble upon something so profound? Is it a fluke? Did he copy it from somewhere? The wall sought a logical explanation that would preserve her worldview. But young Evelyn saw the elegance of the solution, the beauty of the mind behind it, and felt overwhelming admiration. That admiration was a mortal threat to Mrs. Donahue, because if a careless 12-year-old boy could solve in a scribble the problem that defined and destroyed her research career, then what did that say about her? What did it say about her advisor, about the academic system, about the 40 years she had spent teaching fill-in-the-blanks math? The existence of Alex's solution in his notebook was proof that her entire professional life had been built on a false premise. She wasn't defending rigor. She was stifling genius. She wasn't a guardian. She was a jailer. And that revelation was unbearable. To survive, one of her identities would have to die. Evelyn's turning point wasn't a single moment, but a cascade of realizations in her quiet office, with Alex's notebook open on the desk like a sacred relic. The first wave was shock, denial. She rushed to her files, dug out a dusty cardboard box, and pulled out her yellowed thesis. She compared the pages. The equation was the same. Alex's solution was different, simpler, more direct. It used a visual logic that she had only glimpsed. The second wave was memory. Holding the two documents, the past came back with overwhelming force. She remembered the excitement, the feeling of being on the verge, of a great secret of the universe. And she remembered the coldness in her advisor's eyes, the way he dismissed her work, her passion. She relived the humiliation, the doubt that took root in her heart that day. The third and most powerful wave was clarity. She looked at Alex's solution and then at her own failed attempts, and she realized her advisor was wrong. She was on the right track. Her intuition was correct. She wasn't a dreamer chasing a dead end. She was a pioneer whose map had been torn up by someone who didn't have the vision to read it. And now, 40 years later, A quiet boy in her classroom had found the same path and followed it to the end. The silent turning point was this recontextualization of her entire life. The story she had told herself, that of an ambitious young woman who failed and settled for a practical career, was a lie. The truth was that she was a brilliant mathematician who had been silenced, and the proof was right in front of her, in a child's handwriting. In that moment, the armor of the wall cracked and crumbled to dust. The anger she felt toward Alex for being inattentive turned into a debt of gratitude. He hadn't exposed her. He had validated her. He hadn't humiliated her. He had liberated her. He gave her proof that her younger, more hopeful self had been right all along. The decision to tear up the test was not an act of pedagogical defiance. It was a deeply personal act. She was tearing up the contract she had made with herself 40 years ago. The contract to abandon passion in exchange for order, to abandon exploration in exchange for security. She wasn't canceling her students' tests. She was canceling the test she had imposed on herself her entire life. And for the first time in decades, Evelyn Donahue felt the weight of her armor slip away, leaving her scared, vulnerable, and finally free. The demolition of the wall was followed by the slow and careful construction of something new. Evelyn's small victories were not grand, but each one was a step away from her past and toward a future she never imagined. The first victory came the next morning. She arrived at school early, and instead of preparing the board with equations, she wiped it clean. When the students entered, they found the classroom different. She wasn't standing at the front like a general. She was sitting at one of the student desks, waiting. When class began, her voice was softer. "Today," she said, "we're not going to have a normal class. We're going to talk about patterns." The victory was the change in her posture, the breaking of a 40-year routine. It was the first time she had invited the students into her world, rather than forcing them into hers. The second victory was her conversation with Alex. She called him after class, not to her intimidating office, but to the sunny courtyard. She handed him back his notebook. "Alex," she began, her voice a little unsteady, "I didn't understand what you were doing. I was wrong. Can you show me the pattern on the window?" She didn't question him. She didn't ask him to explain the math. She asked him to share his insight. Alex, who had always cowered near her, looked up at her curiously. He didn't use words. He took the notebook, opened it to a new page, and began to draw, showing how the shadows moved, how the angles changed, and how that created the shape of the equation. The victory was the silent exchange of knowledge, where, for the first time, she was the student. The third victory was the battle with the administration. As expected, the decision to cancel the final exam caused an uproar. The principal called her in for a meeting, expecting an explanation. The old Evelyn would have defended herself with rules and pedagogical justifications. The new Evelyn did something different. She brought a copy of her master's thesis and a copy of Alex's notebook page. She didn't talk about the needs of an autistic student. She spoke as a mathematician. "This boy," she said, pointing to Alex's solution, "is doing work that is beyond the scope of any curriculum we could create. My job is not to test him. It is to make sure we don't get in his way." Her conviction was so absolute, her passion so evident that the principal, though confused, backed down. The victory was hers, using her authority not to impose rules but to protect the extraordinary. She became a shield for Alex, the wall she should have been all along. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn felt as if she were waking up from a long sleep. Her small apartment, once just a place to rest between workdays, became a research center again. She spent her nights not grading papers, but diving back into the world of topology, trying to keep up with Alex's intuitive leaps. Her deepest reflection came on a rainy night, with her thesis and Alex's notebook side by side on the kitchen table. She realized that for 40 years, she had confused knowledge with wisdom. She had knowledge. She knew the formulas, the theorems, the history of mathematics. She could teach any topic in the curriculum with her eyes closed. But she had lost wisdom. The wisdom to know that questions are more important than answers. The wisdom to recognize that true genius often doesn't look like what we expect. The wisdom to admit that she didn't know. She reflected on Alex. The system saw him as deficient. He needed support to fit in. But she now saw the truth. The system was deficient. It was incapable of accommodating a mind like Alex's. Society was trying to fix the boy when it should have been trying to learn from him. Alex's disability was his inability to filter the world, and it was precisely this inability that allowed him to see patterns that everyone else ignored. His condition was not a barrier to his genius. It was the source of it. The most painful thing was reflecting on herself. She thought of all the hundreds, perhaps thousands, of students who had passed through her classroom over the years. How many other Alexis had she missed? How many other silent geniuses, artists, poets, scientists had she labeled average or inattentive because they didn't fit her narrow metric of success? The idea was a weight on her soul. She couldn't change the past, but the revelation gave her a new and urgent purpose for the time she had left. Her career was not a failure, she finally understood. It had been a long and tortuous detour, and Alex was the shortcut that brought her back, on track. He didn't just solve her forgotten equation, he solved the equation of her life, balancing the bitterness of her past with the promise of a future with purpose. She was no longer the guardian of dead knowledge. She was the apprentice of a living mind, and that was the greatest honor of her life. The last day of class arrived, and Mrs. Donahue's classroom was unrecognizable. The desks were arranged in groups. The walls were covered with the students' pattern projects. There was an energy of collaboration and discovery in the air. The final exam was, in fact, canceled. In its place, Evelyn created the question fair. Each student had to present not an answer, but a question that had fascinated them during the semester and show the paths they had explored to try to understand it. The focus shifted from certainty to curiosity. The climax of the fair was Alex's presentation. He was not alone. Evelyn stood beside him. On the board was the window equation, now formalized and expanded. Alex, using a laser pointer, pointed to the diagrams he had drawn, while Evelyn, acting as his translator, explained the math behind them to the rest of the class and to the principal, who watched from the doorway, amazed. Alex wasn't just presenting a project. He was giving his first lecture. The truth is, their journey was just beginning. Alex's solution opened up a new field of investigation that Evelyn, with her formal knowledge, was helping to map out. She contacted a former university colleague, now a professor emeritus, and sent him the work. His response was one of shock and excitement. Evelyn's elegant dead end, solved by Alex, was, in fact, a significant breakthrough. The hope is not in $1 million prize or fame. It's in the final scene of that day. The fair is over. The room is empty except for Evelyn and Alex. They are cleaning the board. Alex stops, picks up a marker, and writes a new, even more complex equation. He looks at Evelyn and points out the window at the pattern of clouds in the evening sky. He has found a new pattern. Evelyn looks at the equation, then at the boy, and smiles. A genuine smile, full of joy and exhaustion. The teacher, who had been counting down the days to retirement, now felt she wouldn't have enough time in the world for all the questions she wanted to explore. She didn't give up on giving the test. She gave up believing she already knew all the answers, and alongside her young and unlikely teacher, she was ready to learn. The greatest lessons in life rarely come from the answers we seek, but from the questions we never thought to ask. Genius doesn't need our tests. It needs our permission to flourish. If this story of redemption and discovery moved you, show your support. Like it, comment on a time when a teacher or student changed your perspective, and sign up for more stories that celebrate the power of the human mind. Share this video. The world is full of silent geniuses waiting for someone to finally ask the right question.